Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Moses, and for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you about building an HR committee. A little bit of background regarding who I am. I am managing director of a small personnel consultancy based in the East Midlands, and we currently provide HR advice and support to a number of county associations as well as town and parish councils. So, before we start, big question, why do you want an HR committee? And it's a very relevant question because a number of councillors tell us that they don't want to be managers. What they join the council for is to put something back into the community, to be of benefit to the parish, not to become line managers and get embroiled in all this employment stuff. And that's a very good point. But unfortunately, the legal position is all councillors. The council is the default employer of any employees that you have, whether it's a single employee, the clerk, who maybe works 5 or 6 hours a week, or you have a larger workforce. Under the Local Government Act of 1972, the full council is the default employer. Okay. If you think of that, that raises one or two practical questions. Do all members of the council need to squeeze themselves into a meeting room to deal with a disciplinary issue, to deal with sickness issues, to conduct a recruitment interview? It would be rather bizarre, to say the least, and possibly unreasonable. And for that reason, it makes sense to have a smaller body that takes on responsibility for these employment affairs. And to do that, the council needs to have formal resolution to delegate these powers to this committee. It's done by formal resolution, and in doing so, the council needs to give that committee some very clear and unambiguous terms of reference. Phrases like to address all employment issues or to take care of recruitment, discipline, grievance, etc. just won't do it. That committee needs to have very clear rules of engagement. For example, with recruitment, the committee needs a set of terms of reference which clearly spell out whether or not it deals with advertising a post, interviewing potential recruits, maybe deciding who to appoint, with the obvious exception of the clerk. They can only make a recommendation to full council for that post's appointment. But they do need to know exactly what they can do. And that is for their own protection as well as the council's. It's not unheard of for employment issues to end up in front of an employment tribunal, and for councillors who have been involved in dealing with discipline, dealing with sickness management, maybe dismissing an employee, to be accused of bullying and intimidation because they didn't have the proper authority to carry out those activities. They didn't have the proper terms of reference to give them the authority to make a decision on capability or dismissal. And as such, they are then wide open to allegations, as is the council. So my advice at this stage is to make sure that those terms of reference are very clear, are detailed, and spell out exactly what this HR committee can and cannot do. Now, how many people do we put on this committee? Well, let's start at the lower end. It's got to be more than one, and there's a very good legal reason for that. It's called the Hillingdon Authority, and it goes back to a decision made in the House of Lords in 1986. And what their lordships rule decided is that no individual councillor can take on management responsibility for any aspect of a council's activities. And that, of course, includes employment affairs. So no individual councillor can take on responsibility for appointing recruits, for dealing with disciplinary matters, staff grievances, conducting an appraisal. It has to be by a committee with delegated powers of at least 2 elected members. How big that committee then becomes is up to yourselves and your council to decide. There's no guidelines on that, but whatever is appropriate. The next question is, who do you put on that committee? Well, ideally, it would be nice to have people who've got some experience in the area. People who maybe have management skills, who have worked in personnel, have a personnel qualification, and know a little bit about management affairs and employment issues. But most importantly, we want people who are recognised for their impartiality and integrity. People who carry the respect of the workforce, the employee or employees, as well as elected members, who know that this committee can handle its affairs in a constructive and professional manner. And that is important because this committee is going to be dealing with a lot of potential risky issues. Let me go through what they could be. Starting with recruitment. Recruitment exercise has to be objective. It has to be based on sound decision making, the needs of the council being met by the recruitment process and finding the right people to fulfill what the council wants. That committee has to be able to draw up its selection criteria, conduct its selection process in a manner that picks people who are going to fulfill the council's needs. And if their decision is challenged, for example, somebody believes that they didn't get the job because of discrimination or some other reason, the committee has to be able to defend its actions. The induction process, again, potentially fraught with legal pitfalls. For example, the committee needs to take responsibility for ensuring that every employee has the entitlement to work in the UK. Have they checked the passports or the birth certificates or one of the other defences that can be used to prove somebody's entitlement to work, and has a record of that being kept on the personnel file? Health and safety training. Has the committee made sure that every employee has the skills and competence to do their work safely? And have they made sure that there is a record kept of that? Employment contracts, terms and conditions of employment. Every employee must be given a copy of their contract, their written terms on day one, and the committee needs to make sure that that document, those terms and conditions, meet the needs of your particular council. For example, working hours. Do they suit the needs of the community, of the parish? Are staff working when demand is at its highest? Do you have the right number of people in the right location? Holidays. How are holidays managed to make sure that you have sufficient staff available throughout the year? Annual leave is always a contentious issue. And not only do you have to make sure that staff get their holiday, but that it's calculated accordingly to the working time regulations, and that you don't have everybody out of the office at the same time. Sickness management, absenteeism. On one hand, the committee can decide to discipline somebody whose absences are unacceptable and unreasonable, but also must investigate what are the causes for those absences. And if they're down to chronic long-term health problems, this opens up a big risk to a council of being taken to an employment tribunal for a claim of disability discrimination. And that can be very costly. If the committee's taken on responsibility for this, it must make sure that it investigates health problems, that it gets proper informed professional guidance, such as occupational health specialists, to tell it what is the problem with an employee, whether it fulfills the definition of a disability, and most importantly, what adjustments the council needs to make to help accommodate that person at work. If you don't do that, then the council could be at risk of, as I've already said, some very expensive claims at the employment tribunal. Appraisals. We still encounter councils who believe that one councillor can carry out staff appraisals. Now, believe it or not, that isn't the case. As I've already mentioned to you, the Hillingdon Authority clearly states that no one councillor can conduct management responsibility on their own. And if you think about what an appraisal entails, it is about making decisions about performance, decisions about where improvements are needed, decisions about action planning and training plans. That's got to be made by a committee. Now, normally, if it's for members of staff, the clerk may be able to do that appraisal process on their own. But when we come to doing the appraisal for the clerk, it needs to be done by the council, who will no doubt have delegated that responsibility to the HR committee. The HR committee may then wish to pick a group of 2 or 3 councillors to carry out the clerk's appraisal. Grievances and disciplinary. Obviously, this carries a lot of weight, a lot of potential legal problems in terms of claims for unfair dismissal and constructive dismissal. If the committee are managing grievance and disciplinary issues, first of all, they need very clear terms of reference to say that, for example, they can carry out the investigation meetings, they can carry out the disciplinary hearing or the grievance hearing. They can decide on the outcome, or they refer it to the full council for a decision. And finally, who does the appeals? Is it the full council, or is it somebody else within the committee? Those terms of reference need to be spelt out, because when these decisions do end up in front of an employment tribunal, the procedure will be scrutinised, and the council has to prove that it's followed its own procedures, and that the right people were able to make the decisions, such as dismissal. Were the people who made that decision authorised to do so? Changing employment terms and conditions. All councils need to look and update their contracts of employment. Do they meet the needs of the council? For example, following lockdown, a number of councils have found that their facilities are not as busy as they were before the lockdown, that rooms are not being hired out as frequently, and therefore demand for staff like cleaners and caretakers has dropped. As a result, the council, through its committee, may want to reduce working hours, and with that, pay, holiday entitlement, and other associated terms. That needs the committee to come up with a sound business reason for proposing such action, and then to engage in proper and meaningful consultation with its workforce before any decisions are made. And failure to do that runs the risk of claims of breach of contract and constructive dismissal. So the committee really does have a lot of big issues to deal with, and issues that could result in some costly litigation. Does it have to have all the answers? No, of course not. Nobody has all the answers. The committee needs a resource, a group of advisors that it can call upon. For example, in health and safety, the committee needs to be able to draw upon advice from somebody, an organisation that can produce its health and safety policies and procedures, that makes sure that risk assessments are properly carried out and are up to date and are appropriate to the needs of that council, and that every employee has proper training to be able to do their job safely. Occupational health, I've already mentioned absence management and the need to investigate employees' health problems and to make adjustments to accommodate them. In knowing what adjustments to make, the council needs professional, informed help, and that's where either the employee's GP, consultant, medical team, or the council's own occupational health advisor comes into play. And the committee can draw on other sources of advice, such as the County Association, the SLCC, NALC, and ACAS. So there are resources available, and the committee needs to have access to those, needs to know when to use them. So far, I've talked about a lot of formal employment issues like recruitment and discipline and sickness and appraisals. But there is also the need for day-to-day management. Now, for the employees of the workforce, the clerk probably provides day-to-day guidance, support, clarity of what they should be doing. But who does the clerk go to for help? Who does the clerk lean on? Well, again, if the terms of reference of this committee are drawn up to give the committee that responsibility, then there needs to be a group of maybe 2, 3 members of that committee who can provide a shoulder to cry on, who can provide some clarity, who can support the clerk through their day-to-day activities. And that could be done at the end of a telephone or the social media, such as WhatsApp groups. It could be through a weekly meeting with the clerk or a fortnightly or a monthly meeting. But they provide that resource to the clerk to make sure that they've got somewhere to go just to clear things up and to keep them on top of their job. And that same small group, that group of 2 or 3 members of this committee would also, in all logic, be able to do the clerk's appraisal. Right, so far we've talked about a lot of very serious personnel issues. And along with those issues, normally comes a lot of paperwork, such as application forms for jobs, appraisal forms, transcripts from disciplinary hearings. And all of this is very seriously sensitive data. It's got to be protected by the council. We're all familiar with the GDPR regulations, Data Protection Acts, etc. And that obliges the council to make sure that this sensitive data is stored and managed as securely as possible. What is important is who can access that data. Now, at the start of this presentation, I talked to you about the full council being the default management body. In the absence of an HR committee, the full council carries out these activities. And therefore, all members of that council need to have access to this sensitive data to enable them to be able to do that job, to enable them to be able to carry out disciplinaries and grievances and understand what's going on. However, what we've been talking about is removing that responsibility from the full council to a delegated committee. And it is that committee now that should have responsibility for securing this data, for ensuring its confidentiality. Therefore, the members of that committee now need to see the data. They need to have access to this information so that they can carry out all these activities that I've been talking about. Other members of the council no longer have that need. If they're not on the committee, then they are no longer involved in management activities. They no longer have to make any of these decisions. So they don't have a justifiable need to have access to this sensitive data. So they no longer can see application forms for jobs, appraisal forms. That responsibility rests solely with the committee. And the committee must make sure that it secures that data, that it is stored in a safe location that is not vulnerable to being accessed by people who shouldn't be able to see it. And that when they do use it, they do so in closed session, for example. It's not made accessible to members of the public or even other members of the council. Council members can be informed of general information, such as a pay award, such as the appraisals have been carried out, the training plans are in place, but the actual nitty-gritty remains sensitive and remains only accessible to those members of the committee who have a justifiable aim in being able to see it. Okay, so let me sum up, if I may. As I said at the start, full council is responsible for management activities, but on a practical level, that just won't work in most circumstances. There's too many members of the council. So you need to delegate that responsibility to the HR committee. HR committee, staffing committee, personnel committee, call it what you like. But it is a committee that has very specific delegated responsibility and clear terms of reference to enable it to do what it's doing. And with those terms of reference, they spell out the activities that the committee can do, from recruitment, grievance and discipline, appraisals, sickness management, employment contracts, and they spell that out in very clear and unambiguous terms. And that committee will carry out these activities, but with support of relevant professionals. But that committee must also make sure that it conducts itself with integrity and impartiality. And it is the responsibility of the chair of that committee, and to be the vice chair of the committee, to make sure that that happens. Not only does the committee deal with the formal issues, the big events, but it also deals with day-to-day line management. And as I've mentioned, that could be delegated to a smaller body of 2 or 3 members who work with the clerk daily, weekly, and provide the guidance and support that the clerk needs, whilst at the same time reporting back to the committee meetings on how that is progressing. Finally, the committee must make sure that it retains this information in a confidential and secure way, and that only members of that committee can have access to this important data. I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much for watching, and all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day